Good evening. Well, it's Jack Leahy again, and I'd first like to thank the managers who've invited me to discuss my 60 years as a radio amateur here on the net. I ended last month's presentation by speaking of myself as a high school kid with a general class amateur license. But as high school graduation loomed in 1964, the vice principal addressed my graduating class to remind us that within 3 days of our 18th birthday, we would all become subject to the Selective Service Act, and we must then appear at a local draft board for examination and classification. Now, since graduation was in late May and my birthday was in June, I just hung around a little bit until it was time for me to visit the draft board. I presented myself to the board on schedule, and after a quick validation that I could walk, talk, and chew gum, or any two out of the three, I was classified as 1A. I took this as an omen that it might be wise to try not to be among the hundreds or thousands of young Americans who were en route to Vietnam in 1964. As soon as I received my draft card, I decided to make the rounds of all the various military recruiters, all of whom were conveniently located in the same building with the draft board. I really wanted to see if there was some way I could find a more comfortable way, that is, I, as a ham operator, could make my contribution to our nation's security. So I first visited with the Coast Guard, where the recruiter laughed at me and said that they wouldn't have any openings for several months, or maybe even several years. The Air Force guy seemed always to be out of the office when I went by, and heaven knows the Army and the Marine Corps were the last places in the world that I wanted to be if there was going to be a shooting war in the jungle. But the Navy guy was more receptive, especially since they were offering incentives for licensed amateurs at the time. So I, who couldn't swim to save my life, and once got stranded in a rowboat on a lake upstate, soon wound up on a train from North Philadelphia Station to the Navy Recruit Training Station at Great Lakes, Illinois. I was in a detachment of 20 or so guys from the Philly area, many of whom spent a good part of the time playing cards, and the rest got drunk and threw up all over the railway car. Navy boot camp was no real challenge, since I learned quickly to hide behind a convenient stanchion whenever a working party was called away. But the only thing that's significant to this narrative this evening was a short evaluation of my Morse code capabilities at 15 words per minute. I aced it, and so when I graduated from boot camp, I had received the designation of an RM 2300, a radioman striker, and without the requirement to go to Navy Radioman School in Bainbridge, Maryland, I received orders directly to the naval facility at Lewis, Delaware. I reported aboard there, and it was only within the next year or so that I had made RM3 and later RM2. On the midwatch at Lewis, and it must have been late 67 or early 68, a good buddy of mine, RM3 Mike Crowley, and I developed a scheme. Our boss, Chief Radioman Brown, was a very patriotic and dedicated sailor, and he had left a stack of Navy dream chits on the watch supervisor's desk. Now, dream chits, for those of you who have not had the pleasure of serving in the Gray Funnel line, was the Navy's opportunity for sailors to indicate where they would like to be stationed next. The general consensus among sailors was The dream chits were deep-sixed in some personnel office, probably deep in the bowels of the Pentagon. But Crowley and I decided that we would fill in the chits and request duty in Vietnam as our next preferred assignment. The idea, of course, was not to put ourselves into any sort of danger, but rather to influence Chief Brown into giving us some additional leave time or liberty. We left the signed chits on the Chief's desk for further action. And Chief Brown's reaction exceeded our fondest hopes. He was almost in tears when he read that we had volunteered for Vietnam. He went on and on about how, if he were younger, he would have done the same thing. Yeah, right. And when he approved the chits, he granted us both an additional 72 hours of extra liberty, which we cheerfully spent in nearby Ocean City, Maryland. We were the talk of the communications division, although there was a certain degree of envy about our rather clever, we thought, plan. That is, until our orders arrived. Crowley was going to the Naval Support Activity at Quang Tri, Vietnam, and a few days later I received my orders to the Navy Mobile Construction Battalion 1, a Navy CB unit which was due for rotation to Camp Haskins, just north of Danang, Vietnam. I thought to myself ruefully after the shock had subsided. Somebody, somewhere, actually did read the darn things. When chatting with my detailer, I learned of a program in which licensed radio amateurs in the ratings of Radioman Second Class or Radioman First Class could receive an additional Navy Enlisted Code, NEC, as operators or petty officers in charge of deployed radio stations operated as part of the Navy Mars network. Navy Mars, which was first implemented during World War II, was used mainly for morale traffic, including phone patches between forward deployed personnel and their families at home. He asked that I send along a certified copy of my amateur license, and if everything was in order, he would list the additional NEC code in my personnel record. I did as requested, and in February of 1969 received conditional orders to the Navy Construction Battalion Center in Davisville, Rhode Island. It was a dark and stormy night, as the story goes, when I boarded the train at Philly for the overnight trip to North Kingston, Rhode Island, and it was still a wet and stormy day when I and my now soaking wet loaded sea bag got off the train and caught a cab to the main gate at Davisville. There was no one there to meet me, but the Marine Lance Corporal on the gate guard duty suggested that I make my way to the temporary headquarters of MCB-1. He had no idea where it was, but when I finally found it and I arrived there, just to make conversation, I asked the duty chief petty officer why exactly a mobile construction battalion needed a radioman second class. He thought for a moment and he said, "Well, there are about 700 qualified construction tradesmen in your average construction battalion, but just like certain parts of your anatomy, when it comes for radiomen, every battalion has one. And you, shipmate, are it." I continued the check-in process over the next several days and found a spot in a dusty and decrepit World War II-era barracks, and it waited some information as to what I should be doing next. Finally, I was directed to the other side of the base and was told to find the Mars station there and that I could begin the qualification process for becoming a Mars operator, and, I suppose, if I were really lucky, to become the petty officer in charge at the Mars station at Camp Haskin when MCB-1 redeployed there in July. I met some great guys there, most of whom were hams, by the way, and they were in the process of their own qualifications to operate Mars stations in other parts of the war zone. In particularly, John Greenlee, a second-class radioman, and Fitzgibbon, a first-class radioman, were in the process of completing their qualifications for the stations at Dong Ha and Nam Ho in Vietnam. And since all three of us would be deploying within several weeks of each other, it was good to know that if I was going into harm's way, I at least would have someone to know that I was there. Our tasks and qualifications mainly included learning the Collins equipment inside out, as well as the Henry 2K3 amplifiers, which were installed in every Mars station in Vietnam. There were separate transmitters and receivers, of course, a Collins 77S3 and 75S2, as well as a backup transceiver, the famous Collins KWM2. In addition, we ran phone patches for about 8 hours a day for military personnel in all services who were currently in country. And I must tell you, we had a really fantastic relationship with the telephone operators at New England Bell, particularly at their office in North Kingston, which was the point where the Navy Mars radio circuit from Vietnam terminated into the telephone system. The chief operator at North Kingston was immensely kind to us, and unless it was a particularly busy time at their telephone exchange, she would generally dedicate one or more of her operators to handling the phone patch calls. Given that the stations in country usually limited the time of a call to 5 minutes or so, we could set up 2 calls concurrently and have a third one in the wings to keep the traffic flowing efficiently. During the period when we weren't running traffic, we would chat with the Mars operators already in country and get a good idea about what we would be experiencing when we rotated into their billets. All in all, it really was a great exposure for those of us that were hams into the vital morale function, which was the mission of Navy Mars in the Vietnam War. Since Tim Chase and I were on one of the later elements of MCB-1's deployment to Vietnam, our fellow operator Joe Johnson preceded us by a week or so. When we finally arrived in Danang after a 30-hour flight from Rhode Island, which incidentally was the longest flight I've ever made in my life, we met up with Joe and had our first look at the station that we would operate for the next 10 months. We asked Joe how the turnover from the previous battalion had gone, and he just shrugged his shoulders. Obviously, they were in a hurry to leave, having spent the previous 10 months deployed in beautiful downtown suburban Danang. Well, I did find one problem, reported Joe. Watch this. He rotated the log periodic antenna about 60 degrees counterclockwise. Tim and I went outside and watched this heavy antenna spinning slowly in the sky. Joe called out through the open door, "Okay, now I'm going to rotate it the other way." He turned it 60 degrees clockwise, and the antenna continued its trip, rotating counterclockwise. He stopped the rotor to avoid tangling the RG8U coax any more than it was already. They didn't tell me about that. I had to find out for myself. We debated what we could do to solve this first problem on the first day that we were in country. We had no idea at the moment what the front-to-back ratio on a 13-element log periodic would be, but we knew it had to be great, and our mission would be severely limited if we only had the little dinky 3-element tribander at our disposal. Joe rummaged around a storage box that had been left behind and found 2 sets of pole climbers and 2 well-worn and definitely funky-looking climbing belts. I looked at Tim looked at me, and we both looked at the 40-foot pole, and mostly because we were suffering from severe jet lag, decided that we would just climb it right then to examine the problem more closely. This we did, and we found that it would take a crane at least to lift the huge periodic antenna off of the rotor, and we had no idea where or when we could find one. We were not thinking well at all at the moment, because we were deployed with MCB-1, and if anybody in the history of the human race had access to a heavy crane, it would probably be a CB battalion. But 30 hours on a 707 is enough to make anybody a little shaky. Tim went down the pole again and came back up a few minutes later with a long length of hemp rope. We can swing this thing around the wide end of the beam and then stake it out and set it toward Canas and tie it down so that it doesn't rotate in the wind. If we hit the rotor one more time, I'm afraid it's going to snack the coax for us for sure. Since I was feeling particularly exposed, it being my first day in Vietnam, my main wish at the moment was to get off of that pole and down to the terra firma. We both came down the pole, Tim more elegantly than I, who skinned my way halfway down to the sand below. By this time, Joe had joined us in our backyard. What exactly did the other battalions say about the antennas? I asked Joe. They didn't say anything. They just pointed to them as they ran to get into their 6x and over to the airport. Well, if we can figure out the appropriate beam headings, we should be able to tie the antenna down securely so that it's not rotating in the wind, I thought. We're going to be working through K7UGA near Phoenix, Travis Air Force Base in California, and back through Davisville when the propagation holds up, said Joe helpfully. Phoenix and Travis should have fairly close beam headings, I should think, especially given our distance. I don't know about Davisville, though. We deduced that Phoenix and Travis were really only about 3 azimuth degrees in difference. Phoenix was at 037, and Travis Air Force Base at 040. Davisville, however, was at 358, which was really going to present a problem. But at this point in the game, all we wanted to do was get the station operating, and Joe wandered over to the civil engineering office and borrowed a good compass and a couple of heavy wooden surveyor stakes. We rotated the antenna by hand by pulling on the rope, and until it was approximately at the 040 heading, and thus ended our first day as Mars station operators in the war zone that was Vietnam. Joe very kindly agreed to handle the only contact we had for that evening, a 4-hour scheduled window on 13995 kilohertz, which was a dedicated Mars frequency just below the 20-meter ham band. He suggested that Tim and I get a good night's sleep so that we could launch MCB-1's official Mars station the very next morning. Everything, of course, was predicated on our neighbors not interrupting our night's rest by launching mortars or rocket-propelled grenades or other hardware at the fuel depot, which was conveniently just about 200 meters south of the station. Why someone would plant a 40-foot antenna just a few yards away from a fuel depot is a question which is lost to history. The station building, by the way, was a modified SEA, Southeast Asia multi-purpose hut, designed by the Seabees for use throughout Indochina. In ours, there were 3 compartments in the building: a waiting room that could accommodate, about 20 callers comfortably, the operating position itself, which was crowded but convenient, and also included a homemade telephone booth, so the callers at least had the opinion that they had some privacy, and then a sleeping compartment at the rear of the building with 4 standard Navy bunk beds, which are called racks for the crew. Tim and I hid our racks, and quite honestly, the neighborhood could have been chucking nuclear devices across the wire, and neither Tim nor I would have heard. When we awoke the next morning, Joe let us know that we had run 32 solid phone patches, and that the signal into Travis was better than anything he had heard during the week that he had been assisting the previous battalion. There is much to be said, I should believe, for pointing a multi-band log periodic antenna directly at the receiving station. As time went on, we 3 amigos fell into a routine. Joe preferred to work during the daylight hours and pretty much handled calls going through Senator Barry Goldwater's extensive station in suburban Phoenix. Senator Goldwater was a hero to every fighting man in Vietnam because of the contributions that he, as K7UGA, made to the morale of American servicemen. Tim worked the swing shift, which usually ran through Travis Air Force Base, and I worked a semi-permanent mid-watch handling calls back through Davisville, Rhode Island, where, conveniently, it was morning to mid-afternoon, and propagation was very good on the Mars frequencies, just adjacent to the 15-meter band. In general, we found that we could run between 8 and 10 phone patches per hour, depending on circuit conditions, local activity, and the content of the calls themselves. Because MCB-1 had been in Vietnam on 4 previous occasions, most of our CBs were quite good at understanding the procedure. The usual problem had to do with convincing the parties on the other end of the call that they could not speak until the caller said over. But even with that distraction, we could still maintain a pretty good pace throughout the day. Of the perhaps 1,000 or more phone patches that I handled during my time at N0EFO, really only a few of them stand out. We had one young Navy ensign who had gotten a young lady in trouble right before leaving Rhode Island, and those calls oftentimes turned into a shouting match. I handled another call one evening, and the spouse on our end was trying to help his wife find her car keys, and trying to organize an orderly search around the house, all the while keeping inside our 5-minute call limit. When it appeared that she was getting close and she might actually find the keys, I did grant some additional time. But when the call ended, the car keys were never found anywhere. One of the saddest calls that I recall was for one of our commissary men in our battalion, who was in the process of trying to adopt a young daughter from the orphanage nearby. The amount of paperwork and the obstacles thrown in this poor fellow's faith really defied the description. And truth to tell, neither the American Red Cross representative nor the battalion chaplain were all very helpful in this case. In fact, it seemed to me that the Red Cross woman seemed to delight in placing additional obstacles in the way of the adoption every time the poor fellow thought he was getting close. But by the end of our deployment, things had worked out fairly well, and he was able to escort his new baby home a few days before the battalion was scheduled to return to Rhode Island itself. The last incident that I recall was potentially quite dangerous. Right before Christmas, we had a full waiting room, including several Marines who were stationed nearby. We came under fire again, as usual, and I cleared out the station and had everyone muster in the bunker just outside the front door. The bunker had been built by a previous battalion, and nobody could remember when, and when one of the gunny sergeants leaned up against the sandbag wall, an entire section of the bunker collapsed around him. Shouting words which did not appear in the Marine Corps hymn, he got back up, dusted himself off, and hopped into his Jeep and drove off into a landscape which being peppered by propelled grenades and mortars. Suffice it to say that when our Master Chief Petty Officer got wind of this, Joe, Tim, and I, as well as a work crew of Vietnamese laborers, spent about a week rebuilding the bunker. The gunny sergeant never came back. We continued our station operations and actually completed over about 3,500 phone patches, as well as 20 text messages for all of the military personnel who were stationed in the general vicinity of Camp Haskins. Now, while we were there, we learned that the entire Mars network in Vietnam, some 25 Navy and Marine Corps stations, had been awarded the Navy Meritorious Unit Award for our contributions to the war effort. Now, it was said among sailors that the medal and a dime could get you a cup of coffee, but with inflation, such as it was during that period, the price of coffee had risen to 25 cents a cup. But it was the thought that counted, I suppose. After a 30-day leave during the spring of 1970, I received orders to the Naval Air Station at Roosevelt Roads, Puerto Rico, where, among other things, I served as the trustee of ham station KP4ATQ, Aces, Tens, and Queens, which operated outside the Mars network and under the direction of the Special Services Division, and which managed 2 networks handling phone patches and other traffic for sailors deployed anywhere in the Caribbean. One of these was the Maritime Mobile Service Net, operating at 14,313 kHz, and the other was the Coast Guard Support Network at 14,300 kcs. I was also the leading petty officer at the transmitter site on base, and really enjoyed operating the FRT-40 40 kilowatt point-to-point transmitters that were there. I never gave in to the temptation to tune them to the amateur bands, although it would be fun to have an 80 dB over 9 signal any place in the world. After completing that assignment, I was transferred to the naval station at Adak Island, the Pearl of the Aleutians, 1,200 glorious airline miles west of Anchorage. It was there that I operated from KL7AIZ and had my own call sign, KL7HIV, period. That was a sequentially issued call sign, and one should not draw any conclusions from the letters HIV in that call sign. Suffice it to say, I didn't use it as much as I did KL7AIZ. While phone patches and other services occupied a fairly large amount of our time at both stations, it was possible to get on the ham bands for regular rag chews and other ham activities. And one of the things that I recall from ADAC, because we had a solid pipeline directly into Japan. In fact, the closest shopping to ADAC, Alaska, was either in Vladivostok or in Tokyo. And having pile-ups daily with Japanese operators was a real treat. The nets were very well organized, very polite. There was none of the activities that we sometimes decry here on the HamSphere frequencies or on the amateur bands. And if you needed to go take a break for 15 minutes or so, the pile-up would still be there waiting for you with the same operators in the same order that you had left them. Very good operating position indeed. And in the spirit of saving the best for last, I just want to mention for a moment my 4 years at the Joint U.S. Navy and Canadian Forces base at Argentia, Newfoundland. Unfortunately, the nature of that assignment precluded any amateur activity, and in fact, any kind of radiation of RF from the base was well regulated. But the immensely friendly and kind-hearted people of Placentia Bay, Newfoundland, made it all worthwhile. I actually pulled strings, or attempted to anyway, to stay there longer. But since it had been several years since I'd been afloat, the Navy wanted to make sure that I had not forgotten that sailors belong on ships, and ships belong at sea. But that's another story entirely. This presentation is being written in November of 2019, and that's a month in which we all remember, in particular, the sacrifices that military veterans of our own and allied nations have made throughout the years. And when I look back at Vietnam, although we were limited in the amount of combat that we Mars operators saw, I think about all of the soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen that did not come home from Vietnam. We always think about our own sailors and soldiers, the 58,300 whose names are on the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington. But there were many others. There were over 5,100 military personnel from the Republic of Korea who did not go home. There were, almost 500 Australians, 350 Thais, and 37 Kiwis from New Zealand. You know, I can't think of a better way to end this discussion than by quoting a small part of the poem For the Fallen, which was written during World War I, the war to end all wars. Well, that didn't work out. And so I ask any of you, veterans or not, who might remember these words, to recite them quietly offline to yourself. They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. And at the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. So 7 3s. This is Jack, KW5A.